story, I guess, is a little bit similar to Josh's. I'm a lot older than Josh, but as a youngster, I was very passionately interested in anything to do with transport, and I had no idea where that came from. It wasn't as if my dad worked in transport or anything like that. I was also passionately interested in anything to do with cities. I grew up in Titirangi, or the back beyond Titirangi in the bush. Coming to the centre of Auckland was a really big deal when I was a kid. It didn't happen very often, like probably only a handful of times a year, but that was in the days when the centre of Auckland was the centre of Auckland. Everything happened here in the city. And coming here, often on a Friday night when the shops were open late, because they wouldn't open on the weekends, there was so much happening right in the centre, and I was completely fascinated by all of the activity, all of the chaos, everything that was happening. And Jarrett, our guest speaker, was talking yesterday about that. I think he had a similar experience of relating to going into the centre of Portland, I guess, and seeing all these buses going to all these destinations and being fascinated by all the places they were going to. And I had the same experience here in Auckland of all these suburbs, the signs on the front of the buses, all these places I had no idea where they were or what was there, but there was something exotic about the sheer variety of all the places and the transport system that served the city. So in terms of thinking about a career, I was thinking in terms I would really like to work in transport or maybe as a town planner. I thought I wasn't artistic or creative enough to be an architect, but I was very interested in the whole notion of town planning. Town planning then was about, I suppose the relationship between cities and architecture, and it was so I did embark on a planning career because there was no such thing as a qualification in transport, and there still isn't in New Zealand. So that's the path that I followed. I went to, at that stage I was living in Christchurch, and I went to Massey University to do a planning degree, a Bachelor of Regional Planning. And then the Resource Management Act came along in 1991, I think it was. By then I had already jumped ship because I did my degree in Palmerston North. I went to a first job in Hamilton working for the then Waikato County Council, and my job was to advise farmers on how close to the road they could build a hay shed or whatever, and that just didn't quite do it for me. And a job came up at the Wellington Regional Council, working as they wanted a planner who could work in their new transport section to really, I suppose, be the liaison between land use planning and their very new role in transport planning, public transport planning and funding. And so that's the job I applied for and got. And went off to Wellington in 1986 to take that role. And I have to admit, it was a little bit quiet in those first few years, Steve, wasn't it? By comparison with what it's been since. But it was quite good timing, because what happened in 1989 was that the legislation changed. The way in which we organised public transport in New Zealand changed completely. Until then, we had a variety of public transport operations that were often owned by the city, or in Auckland's case the Auckland Regional Authority, publicly owned and operated. We had some private companies, we had the railways, and they were all doing their own thing, and they were funded differently. And that all changed in 1991 when we introduced the notion of tendering in public transport. So I stepped into that environment. I actually put together the Wellington Regional Council's submission on the legislation that was introduced in 1989 to completely restructure the way the industry was organised. And then involved in 1991 in the first round of tendering for public transport, when we had 4 months to receive what were called commercial registrations from bus companies to say what they would operate commercially. We had 4 months to decide what we would put it out to tender, award contracts, and see all the services change. It's mind-boggling how quickly we did that 20-something years ago. I think I'm a nearly the very last survivor from that period in New Zealand public transport history, and now we're going through the process all over again in terms of completely restructuring how we organise public transport, how we fund it, and in terms of something called public transport operating model. So we're seeing another change of legislation, which is actually a very exciting opportunity to, I suppose, reclaim some sense of the whole public transport system as a network in New Zealand, and to because it's rebalancing things. That 1991 legislation was at the height of the free market reforms in New Zealand, and we picked up the model that had been used in the UK, which was all about the commercialisation of public transport. And in many ways we're still recovering from that experiment. So in terms of how public transport is, we've now got a new opportunity to turn it around. So it's a fascinating time to be involved in public transport. There is so much going on, it is never ever dull. I wouldn't ever suggest to any of you that it was an easy option to follow. But I think Pippa and Josh have already spoken about the incredible variety of things that come across my desk every day. And the scale of things is remarkable. And for some reason this a particular day sort of is stuck in my head, where I went to a meeting in the morning about a possible future busway that we might one day build from Henderson to the North Shore. Now that's obviously probably 30 years away. You know, we've got the Northern Busway, we're talking about one on the Northwestern Motorway leading into the city. We're thinking about one that might one day go from West Auckland to the North Shore. So I had a meeting about that, what its alignment might be, where the stations might be. All very sort of pie in the sky, all very theoretical. And I got back to my desk and I had to ring somebody who was upset, a shop owner in Milford. She was upset because there was a bus stop outside her restaurant and there was a seat at that bus stop. And the local kids were standing on the seat and poking their tongues out at the patrons in her restaurant. and I had to placate her and decide whether or not we should take the seat away, knowing that if we took the seat away, we'd get abused by some little old lady because there wasn't a seat at her bus stop. And that I'd probably get abused by someone from the local board because I hadn't consulted her or whatever. So getting back to, I suppose, the skills, the political skills required, I'm not saying that I've got them necessarily, but you're dealing directly often with politicians. So I for example, go and talk to local boards. We've got 21 local boards in Auckland, and I think I've been to every one of them now except Great Barrier Island because it's not completely relevant. So I'm talking to local boards at that level about our intentions for the public transport network as a whole, and trying to sell them the concept of a all of Auckland integrated public transport network that we want to implement over the next 3 or 4 years. And they all sort of accept that that's a great idea, and then they go straight into the detail. But what about, this road here or that street there? And it's all related to some, the last person they talked to probably, who harangued them about how poor the bus service was or whatever. So it's constantly sort of seesawing between that high level thinking and what it means on the ground for individual bus users. And I think Josh or Pippa has talked already about every single one of you in this room could come and tell me now exactly what's wrong with public transport in Auckland. And I probably have heard it all before. But there is, the sheer sort of variety and the juggling that you have to do. I mean, we had the most fascinating day today working with Jarrett Walker, who's going to speak after me, in terms of the network here in Auckland. As we restructure the network, what it means on the ground for what buses will do in the centre of Auckland. in the context of the growth that we're anticipating, the fact that there's a huge expectation that we make the centre of Auckland a lot more pedestrian friendly, a much nicer place to be, and probably double the number of residents and double the number of jobs in the middle of Auckland, and somehow serve it with public transport on fewer streets, and we're under pressure to reduce the impact of buses. And that is just the most enormous juggling exercise, because we have to think, well, you know, if we change this, what does it mean? If we change this particular route, what does it mean for this route over here? The problem-solving skills required are sometimes beyond us, to be honest. It's very, very complex, as I say, never ever dull, and the variety is fantastic as well. So I think at that point we're happy to answer questions afterwards.
Great, thanks.